it's a strange it's a
Sorry, go ahead.
strange thing from my reading of him is he's not really a religious Zionist. I mean, he's
Right.
really more of a revisionist that uses religion as a tool of promoting a particular kind of identity and pride. But it doesn't he doesn't really have the religious Zionist view, whether it's the view of Rev Reines or the view of Rev Cook. It's
Right.
just that you don't see it.
Right. He has his own, you're saying, your own, his own messianic rather than practical Zionism. Definitely not. Well, actually, now I don't know. Perhaps maybe more practical than messianic. It's a
It's.
little
I
bit
think it's.
confusing.
I think it's a. Well, I put it this way. I don't think that he was a messianist per se. I think that once he writes books like 40 Years in Ramla Prison in the 1980s, he becomes kind of apocalyptic. He becomes messianic, but not in the sense of this is the unfolding of the messianic era, the founding of the state of Israel, the return of the Jews from the four corners, a kind of cookie vision. It's like, no, Zionism has failed and it's going to collapse in on itself. And that is the apocalypse that will bring about the true Jewish state, which is a very different vision than that kind of messianism that you see in Rev Cook. It was really the corruption of the lost opportunity of Zionism was the last stage before the collapse and then the emergence of the messianic era. So 40 years is essentially a commentary on the prophet Ezekiel. And it's, Ezekiel, there's a lot of real ugly stuff that's going to happen in Ezekiel. So, he saw this notion of Chil Hashem and Kiddush Hashem, that the state was a Chil Hashem for him, right? And the Kiddush Hashem was basically undermining it.
That's interesting. Um, let's talk about when you um, the intermarriage. When Rabbi Kahana writes his book "Why Be Jewish" back in the United States, at a time, this was in the '70s, I believe, right?
74, yeah.
This is at a time when you say that intermarriage was not exactly at the forefront. It wasn't considered a crisis, and he, you know, has this prescient kind of notion that American Jews are sort of intermarrying into oblivion, and most people didn't see it that way. Although I'm sure you're aware that intermarriage has long been a problem in America. I mean, I would
Mhm.
say for a century. Are you referring to intermarriage among children of survivors or survivors, first
Yeah,
or second generation American?
here's the thing. It is true, and somebody else asked me this too, and I should have been clearer in the book. He's not the first one to write about intermarriage. There's certainly,
Right.
plenty of talk about intermarriage. Jewish sociologists, Nathan Glazer and Charles Liebman, and people in the 60s were seeing the trend. They were seeing it kind of move forward. His intervention on intermarriage was, which I thought was novel, was basically saying to the American liberal Jewish community, of course Jews are going to intermarry. Like, what do you think? You live in a liberal society. Why shouldn't they intermarry? And he uses the 1972 sitcom Bridget Loves Bernie, which was the first television program about intermarriage between a Lower East Side Jewish man and an Upper East Side Catholic Jewish woman. And the whole point of the television show Bridget Loves Bernie was to show that, of course, intermarriages work, right? You mix together people and families and so on, and the American Jewish community or establishment, whoever it was so upset at the television show that they convinced the network to end it after a season. And Kahana writes the book as a response to that to say, why are you doing that? You produce this. This is American Jewry, right? Bernieism, right? Bridget loves Bernie. It's Bernieism. Bernie Steinberg. That's the American Jew. So that's his intervention. It's not looking at it sociologically in terms of what are the rates and he's basically saying, look, this is the American Jewish project. If you want to be here, people are going to intermarry. That's just what it is to be American, unless you create some other reason for Jews to marry Jews. Right, and
So in that sense, I guess
it's not necessarily move to Israel. You have to just create some reason, some identity, some sense of pride, where a Jew is going to say, "No, I'm not going to marry a non-Jew." But if you don't do that, then goes into hate. That's what's going to happen.
how
And I
is the
think
book received?
it's
Did it
hard
make
to.
it?
It's very hard to say because these books were published by what would today would be considered kind of almost private publishing presses that
Right.
Kahane just had a benefactor that financed it.
Right.
So they weren't really didn't sell well. The only book that sold well was Never Again because it was published by a reputable press and it sold 100,000 copies in the first year, which is pretty good for a Jewish book. Um, but why be Jewish? It was who knows. It got around. I mean, I don't know how many people read it, but I think it's an interesting moment where you see that for Kahana, the enemy, whether it's in Israel or whether it's in America, the enemy is always liberalism.
On the other hand, he respects Jews who fight for something rather than those who fight for nothing.
Right.
He reserves his biggest contempt is reserved for those Jews who don't stand for anything, the apathetic Jews, the neutral Jews. He respects Jews on the radical left
Yeah.
more than he respects Jews who are apathetic or who say they agree with him but do nothing. I mean, he says this a lot, which is very
Yeah.
interesting,
Yeah. I
as you
mean,
point out.
he wrote a kind of eulogy for Abby Hoffman in the Jewish press after Abby Hoffman died. It wasn't a very nice one, but at least, in other
I
words,
can,
he's quoted as saying in the early '70s, he was speaking in a synagogue, and somebody says something about the long-haired hippies, and he says, "Oh no, you think I'm really against them? I'm not really against them. They're really standing up for something. We just have to get them to stand up for the right thing."
right. Dov Aharoni Fish, who was a leader of the JDL, wrote a book called Jews for Nothing. I don't know if you're familiar.
No.
He was active in the JDL. There were some big people who had a falling out with him. There were quite a few. Kind of made a name for themselves in other places. Were very Marvin Antelman and others were active in the JDL. I think most of the regional directors of JDL were secular, as you say, were college students. They were secular. They were proud Jews. Many of them, I think, came from actually radical left backgrounds.
Yeah.
They were in radical left politics, but they were bewitched, I guess, for lack of a better word, by Kahana, showing up to lecture at the university or whatever it was, and they joined the JDL, and
Yeah.
it was an interesting time. Yeah.
And Bertrand Zweibahn, who was really actually the right hand, really Kahana started the JDL with Bertrand Zweibahn, who was a middle-aged secular Jewish lawyer. I mean, Marty Dogan. I don't know whether Marty Dogan, who was the other person really at the helm. I'm not sure whether he was Orthodox or not, but Zweibahn certainly wasn't.
Right. Right. Um, right. There were many others who were not or traditional things like that. But that wasn't, like you said, that wasn't his end all. As long as you were a proud Jew and wanted to fight for Jewish causes, and that was the main thing.
Right.
In Israel, though, I should say, later on, he was asked about his supporters, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. Kind of switching between Israel and America.
Right.
In Israel, his strongest base of support are in what's called development towns, like Pituach, mostly Jews who come from Muslim countries, from the Middle Eastern countries, Mizrahim, if you will. And most of them are not observant, don't necessarily want a halachic state. If you asked most of them, they would say probably no. They'd rather not have one. And there are two questions there. One, how do you think he tapped into kind of that community? Why were they receptive to him? That's one question. The other one is more an observation that when Kahana was asked, what do you think of your supporters and their, less than, enthusiastic perception of the concept of halachic state, he said, listen, I don't know if that was I'm paraphrasing. He said, I'm not happy. The fact that my supporters don't want a state that follows the halakha, but they support me on the Arab issue. They like my message on the Arab, but not necessarily my message on creating a Torah-based government. It's an interesting observation, though.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the
Yeah.
first point, I think you're right. Obviously, that was a base. He knew that was going to be the base early on. The reason that I think he was able to capture their attention is that he was able to portray the the left labor Ashkenazi governing elite as in a certain way the way that African Americans saw the liberal white governing elite. that he was able to convince them that he was actually also out to undermine that Ashkenazi normative labor
Right.
elite government. Because you have to remember, at that time, right, the governments were always left wing governments until 1977,
Yes.
right?
Right.
So
So the big.
yeah, so he was able to do that, and then, once Begin wins in '77, I mean, Begin also is able to win because Likud was able to attract that group of people too. I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think that a lot of the Mizrahim that were his base shared his vision of creating a Jewish monarchy or some kind of halachic state. But that was okay. I mean, he needed them to vote for him. It didn't, they didn't
Right.
have to, he had the religious Zionist sector on his side that were
True.
interested in that part of his vision.
A section of the religious Zionist sect. I
Yeah,
mean, the religious
section,
Zionist
right, of course.
establishment obviously
Of
did
course.
not rejected
No,
him
no,
as
no. The
well.
establishment did not go along with him. No, that's for sure.
Um, there's something I wanted to say about the halachic state aspect. And it just skips my mind. We'll skip. I'll ask about something else. Um, so, like you say, Kahana has always kind of rejected and defied a neat categorization. Someone was telling me about a friend of his who is a member of Antifa and has a picture of the slogan, the JDL slogan, the JDL logo, the fist, and maybe even a picture of Kahana or something. And it struck me as like seems so incongruous, but maybe it isn't.
It isn't. Look, this is something that people that study, radical politics, radicalism on the right and left very
Mm-hmm.
often end up coming together. I
Indeed.
mean,
Yeah.
I knew people who were really pretty leftist Jewish radicals, um, who became JDL members, and they still were fighting for leftist causes, right? So, and again, I said, the Soviet Jewry movement brought the JDL and the Chavurah movement together. I mean, these were people on opposite sides of the political spectrum about everything. And one of the big things was the Vietnam War. Kahana was extremely angry that the American Jewish establishment came out against the Vietnam War. He was extremely in favor of the Vietnam War. He was extremely in favor of Richard Nixon. He saw he saw the left as being dangerous on the level of liberalism as promoting assimilation, but also the connection between um, China, the Soviet Union, and the Arab world. I mean, what the interesting thing about Kahana is that he brings together Cold War mentality and American counterculture in interesting ways. Because he really saw the problem in Israel with the Arabs was inextricably tied to the problem of communism in the Soviet Union and the problem of communism in China.
Jumping back to Israel, I just remember
Yeah,
what I wanted to ask you. So you would often address his audiences, and he would say, "You who came from countries like Libya and Egypt and Morocco, you know who the Arabs are. You know what they've done to you and what they could do to you. That's why the Ashkenazi establishment they don't know. They live in an illusion, thinking they can make peace. What do you
sure.
that's something? Yeah,
Yeah,
that was something that we always say."
right.
And it was and the message was received. They were receptive to that message.
Yeah.
I mean, his constituency.
I mean, the interesting thing is that the Mizrahi communities actually did have firsthand experience living in the
Right.
Arab world in both ways. I mean, many Moroccan Jews have they have very mixed feelings about their Moroccan life and their life in Israel, and they go back they go back to the basic Pharos in Morocco, and they can't to visit. It's a complicated it's a complicated story. Kahana didn't really have any experience with the Arab world, but had a certain kind of vision of what they were. And in a certain sense, I think that for him, in some way, the Arab in Israel became the African American in America. I mean, he transferred that kind of feeling of of anti-Semitism that he felt from African Americans for a variety of reasons, um, to the Arab world. So yes, his basic attitude was we, meaning Kahana and his, cohort, we understand much better that the Arabs, as he says, the Arabs are no less Zionist than we are. They're not going to trade in their national aspirations for a washing machine and running water. So the whole notion that, oh, well, if we integrate them into the society, we make them part of the culture, they'll eventually give up their national aspirations. And Kahana said, no, it's not going to happen. And the truth is, he was right about that.
Yeah, but at the same time, he offered compensation for them to leave. So how does that square with that? That
Well,
that never.
because he knew it was a zero sum game. He knew that in a sense it was either going to be a Jewish state or it was going to be an Arab state. And so he didn't necessarily, he was, as you say, he was trying to buy them out. I hate to say it. I hate to say it, and I just thought of it now, but it's not completely different from, some of the Abraham Accords. You give the UAE enough money and you give them enough planes and they'll say what you want. It's a kind of capitalist diplomacy. In a certain sense, that's what Jared Kushner did. He just bought them out. Basically the assumption. I'm not a real estate guy, right? But the assumption of real estate, as far as I know, is like everyone has a price.
That's an interesting observation.
And Kahana felt it too. Look, if these people have to know. This was his view. These people have to know that their national aspirations are not going to be met, and therefore, why not just take the money and go somewhere else? I think he misunderstood them though, because I think that they were not interested in that for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. Who do you who are you trying to reach with this book? Is there a specific um, part of the population, or is this for everybody?
Well, look, I wrote it as an academic book. I published it
Mhm.
in, with the university press. I wrote it though with the intention that it would reach two audiences. First, well, three audiences. First, really historians of American Judaism. I think that Kahana, you can't tell the story of post-war American Jewry without Meir Kahana. He plays an ubiquitous role not only in his personal presence but in the things that he said and the influence that he had. That's number one. I also, would hope to attract an audience of scholars that really are, that are scholars of American radical politics and say, here's someone that you haven't heard of. I mean, here's actually an exemplar of a real Jewish radicalism. And it's actually more complicated and nuanced than we think and worth paying attention to. And the other group, of course, is just to the larger Jewish community to say, we ignore, I mean, certainly on the liberal side, I think we ignore Kahana at our own peril, because I think that, he's still a specter in our Jewish culture in America. In Israel, it's a much easier thing in a way, because in Israel you still have people that identify as being Kahanas. So Kahana is part of the conversation in Israel. But in America, it's really not. Like, Meir Kahana, he's the guy that went to Israel, as opposed to, wait a second, he actually like had this incredible impact on post-war American Jewry, specifically first generation, Americans who were children of immigrants and survivors. And we've just forgotten about it. I mean, you wouldn't write a history of post-war African American, you know, African Americans without talking about Malcolm X. I mean, that would be completely.
And I guess the simple reason why he's not mentioned, say in Jonathan Sarna's History in American Jews, because
Yeah, I think
he's an
there's, I think there's, an,
embarrassment or
I think there's an intention to really erase him. He
erasing
was
from
just an
history.
aberration. Really
Aberration.
didn't really have that much of an impact. Not someone that we're not proud of, and let's just kind of move on. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
Who do you think in America, or what group or what organization kind of comes closest to, let's say, the JDL or to the figure of Rabbi Kahana today?
Today,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know, because we live in a very different world. I mean, we're not living in a world of real leftist militarism in that way. I mean, the militarism has moved to the right. So you have like, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, right? These are right wing militarist groups that, in a sense, are trying to
Antifa,
open.
BLM,
What's that?
no,
I don't think
Antifa,
you have. I mean, BLM. The thing with BLM is BLM isn't a thing. It's just an umbrella. I mean, there's an umbrella movement. There are many different organizations that are part of it. You have Antifa that's part of it, and you have all these other organizations that are part of it. I don't see. I see that Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, in a way, have adopted a more of a militant radical politics where violence is the mode of achieving goals. I think that's what you saw January 6th. I think you saw that in a number of other places. There is, there is on the left, there are certainly on the left militant groups, but I don't know if there certainly isn't a charismatic figure um, in those groups that I know of, or on the reactionary right, frankly. You could say someone like Steve Bannon, maybe, but Steve Bannon is a very complicated figure. It's not clear what he's connected to, right? He's not a real in the street activist. So I don't know. It's a good question.
one wonders. I mean, if you had a crystal ball, one wonders what Kahana would say about the crazy times that we're living in. We have been living in, in the since his assassination, I would say.
Yeah.
For instance, what would he have said about the election of Donald Trump,
Right.
or the place of of Jews in America today, or what's been going on in Israel,
Right. I mean,
Gaza?
I mean, in America, two things happen that I think are interesting vis-a-vis Kahana. One is the rise of neoconservatism, which in many ways was a kind of secularized, quasi-Jewish version of Kahana's, reactionary ideas. That's number one. And the second is multiculturalism, which is something that he could not have predicted. So that, in fact, the survival of and success of orthodoxy in today's America is in large part, in my view, riding the wave of multiculturalism. Suddenly, difference, tolerance, difference was not only tolerated but celebrated. And I think that in a certain sense would have undermine Kahana's basically theory that it's all about the disappearing Jew. I mean, there is no disappearing Jew really in America today because multiculturalism makes it much easier for the Jew not to disappear. Now, it's not to say there aren't obviously many Jews that disaffiliate and so on, but I'm just saying Kahana was living in a much different cultural environment than we're living in today.
On the other hand, what would he have said to? I don't know if you consider this an aberration or not. These spasms of anti-Jewish violence that was occurring in New York and last year and the year before, whether it was
Yeah.
the shooting in Jersey City or the
Right.
stabbing in Muncie, or the random attacks on a daily basis in places like Crown Heights. And why is it that there isn't anyone today who says, "Hey, it's time to make something like the JDL"?
That's a great question. Interestingly enough, you talk about Crown Heights. There was an organization called the Maccabees that was run by Chabad in Crown Heights in the 60s that was really doing what the JDL did. And Kahana knew about them because he had spent time in Crown Heights. So, in many ways, the JDL was Kahana's version of the Maccabees. He actually went much further. The Maccabees were just limiting themselves to, civil patrols. I think it's a good question. I really do think that the notion of a kind of militancy does not have the same kind of resonance today that it had in the 1960s. Not only among Jews, but among other ethnic minorities. It's just a very different environment. The urban ghettos were exploding. You had boycotts and protests in the South. BLM, in some way, BLM is interesting because it's not an ethnically and racially exclusive movement. There are many people. There are many white people that are involved in BLM. There are many Asian people, right? It's not like the Black nationalists. The Black nationalists basically didn't want white people in the movement. That's what Stokely Carmichael said in this famous 1966 speech about SNCC, right? All whites can leave. So, BLM today is part of a larger progressivism that's actually multi-ethnic. And also the whole concept of ethnicity has changed so much with interracial marriage and What I call in my previous book, Post Ethnicity. It's such a different world. I mean, it's a world. It's funny to think that Kahana really only like died, what, 30 years ago, but it's such a different world, a world that he couldn't have imagined. Although, in terms of the anti-Semitism in Brooklyn, and he would have said, "Of course, it's going to happen. That's just the way it is."
Right.
All
Told you
you
so.
can, yeah, all you can do is create deterrence.
Hmm. Yeah, but Israel, um, well, told you so in Israel as well, right?
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
what he.
Israel, in you know, who knows? I really think that by the end of his life, Kahana really lost faith in Zionism, and he really saw it as a failed project. And he look, the state had rejected him. Zionism had rejected him, right? He had rejected America, so he's really kind of a homeless person in many ways those last years, and a very sad person. I mean, I was able to look at the correspondence between him and Avi Weiss. Avi Weiss was kind enough to give me his letters, and you see by the end, in the late 1980s, he was very, very sad situation. He couldn't get shuls to allow him to speak. He was going from one place to another. He didn't really have a place in Israel anymore. Um, had he lived, it's not clear what would have happened. Who knows what would have happened?
Someone mentioned something. I didn't find any corroboration that he told people who did want to vote to vote for the Haredi parties or something along those lines.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I think he switched into a more Haredi mode at some point. Which in a certain sense is um, uh, a recognition that the political process was hopeless.
Right.
It
And,
was,
and you see that in the Hilltop Youth, for instance, phenomenon in Israel, who I guess are his most loyal constituents today, who follow kind of his philosophy, who for them Zionism is a curse word. It's a dirty word.
yeah.
They reject the flag in places like Yitzhar. The flag is rejected. It's even burnt in some cases. I mean, after
I,
they not quit. Right.
I was at a conference in Jerusalem at the Van Leer Center, and there were a bunch of young, hilltop youth types, settler types. And during the call, it was on Nachman of Bratslav, the conference. That's why they came around. So, during one of the coffee breaks, I was schmoozing with them, and I said, like, "What are you guys learning?" And they said, "We're learning Rav Nachman." And uh, I said, you're not learning Rav Kook. He says, "No, we don't learn Rav Kook. Rav Kook is for our parents, right? It's too statist." I said, "What's the problem? These are the children of the Hitnat right?" So I said, "Well, what's the problem with that?" They said, "The state abandoned us. Nachman is about Eretz Yisrael. It's not about the state." And it was great conversation, because I think it really is true among a generation of Israelis, the children of the Hitnat, who have
Yes.
basically given up on the state.
They have given up on the religion, and ascribing any religious significance, the atchata, the geula, that kind of thing, the cookie and mystical, um, right. On the other hand, I don't think Rabbi Kahana changed some basic things until the day he died, in terms of like celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut and saying Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut. I don't think that changed ever. He was
No,
very, very
no, it
much
didn't. It didn't go that
proponent
far.
of it.
It didn't go that
Didn't
far.
go
He
that.
wasn't willing to. He wasn't willing to, like, exit that completely. And as you said, he sent his kids to religious
Merkaz
Zionist
Arav.
schools. Yeah, Merkaz. His son learned in Merkaz. I mean, that was the only, that there was no other place. He
It
lived
came
in Madison.
closest. Yeah.
You know,
And in his own yeshiva, you're still around actually. Rayona UED in
right.
very Haredi neighborhood over there. Been there several times. But the people who kind of took over the movement, people like Michael Ben Ari, Itamar Ben Gvir, and most of these people come, Noam Fetterman. These are all people, like you say, from the religious Zionist settler movement, especially Michael Ben Ari, who actually was a classmate of Benjamin Kahana.
Right. I think one of the I think this, there may be others, but um, one of the, I think, remaining real, like, unreconstructed Kahanis is Baruch Marzel. He really comes from that, and he also has American parents. He was born in America, moved to Israel as an infant, but there's a way in which Marzel really kind of continues to embody Kahana's vision in a way that a lot of the other ones don't. I think. I mean, they utilize his tactics,
Right.
but
Why do you think Marzell is different than the others?
I think Marzell's different than the others. Yeah, I mean, I don't, I don't know him. I mean, I saw there's actually a very interesting Noah Osban did a very interesting documentary called Radical Jew about him. But that's my sense from seeing clips of him and listening to him speak that he really seems to to embody that the older Kahana rather than the kind of neo Kahana.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting.
I mean, maybe Moshe Levinger too. It could be.
Levinger was his own person. He wasn't
Yeah.
really a Kahana follower.
Yeah. Right.
He had
Right.
similar ideas,
Yeah.
but he wasn't exactly. I mean, he was active, I think, before. And I had this interesting, not theory, but Kahana was an interesting kind of combination in terms of his roots, where he came from. His father was born in pre-state Israel in Tzfat, from a family of sons of Hasidim who came on Aliyah on orders of the founder of the Sons of Dynasty, Rabbi Chaim Halberstam, the Rabbi Chaim, in the was in the early 1800s of late 1700s, and founded the Sons of Communion in Tzfat. His father was still born there, and he studied in Eastern European yeshivot, and then he immigrated to New York, Charles, or Cheskel Shraga.
Right.
His mother, though, was a real Litvak, from a real Litvak background, and oftentimes I see a combination of Galiciana and Litvak, an explosive mix.
Interesting. Yeah.
Galiciana, especially, sounds is a pretty extreme. They're known for their extremism in many ways. I would think the Satmar, a lot of Satmar's I guess extremism comes from sons. I think. I mean, it's not just me that thinks that, but then I think Satmar, Munkac is actually a much better example of that.
Yeah.
The Shapira family originally was Galiciana from Dinner, right?
Right. Right.
His mother was, it seems, I think the mother's, I think that tempered him, like his Litvak background tempered him, while the sons are paternal heritage kind of, got him going.
Yeah.
It's my own theory.
The other interesting tidbit to this, I just wanted to add, um, his his father's brother's son, so his first cousin, was a person named Moshe Kahana, who was a rabbi in Houston and was a civil rights activist and actually marched
Right.
with King in Selma in '65.
Yeah.
I think he was. I think he was the rabbi of a conservative shul, if I'm not mistaken, for many years. And Kahana used to visit him and stay with him when he was, traveling around the country raising money. And Moshe Kahana is an interesting character in and of himself. There's actually somebody now working on a book comparing Meir Kahana and Moshe Kahana. I mean, Kahana was an older, which I just read actually I read part of the manuscript. It's actually quite interesting. Moshe Kahana was an older cousin, so I think he was about 10 years older than him, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. And he had a good relationship with him,
Yeah,
even though they were complete opposite ends of the
that's what they
political
say.
spectrum.
That's what they say. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it makes sense in light of what we said about Kahana actually, admiring people on the radical left, but not necessarily agreeing with their goals, but that kind of thing. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Okay. It was really a pleasure to chat with you. And I'm going to put the book in the frame, so if anyone wants to pick
Thank
it
you.
up.
I
Meir
appreciate
Kahana by Shaul Magid.
it.
Interesting, absorbing read. I get the sense, though, that you can do another volume. I get like a sense that there's a lot more to talk about.
There is a lot more to talk about, but I'll let somebody else talk about it. I
Let
think.
somebody else take it. Okay.
Yeah, I'm actually working.
It,
I'm actually working on a book project now on the old Teitelbaum of Satmar. So I've kind of like entered into another. I do have an interesting essay that people might be interested in a festschrift coming out for a Jewish philosopher named David Novak, and the title of it, because David Novak wrote this interesting book called Judaism and Zionism, and it's basically a comparison of Novak, Teitelbaum, and Kahana on Judaism and Zionism. And I really put Kahana and Teitelbaum into conversation with each other because they actually have more to say to each other than you think.
they do have a lot of things in common. That's definitely true, especially in their attitudes, and their orientation. Otherwise, all right. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you chatting with me.
I
And
appreciate it.
but I'm looking forward to your upcoming work, and we'll talk about that as well.
Okay,
All right.
thanks
Thank
a
you so
lot.
much.
I really
Have a good,
appreciate it. Thank you.
have a good night. Bye.
You too.